Hello, my name is Sarah Yashua, and I've been a Baltimore County Master Gardener since 2014. In this program, I learned how essential insects are as part of a healthy ecosystem, and I also discovered that some of our most beneficial bugs are in decline. I went on to become a University of Maryland Extension Master Naturalist in 2015, and through these programs, I have really found my passion in talking with people about sustainable ways to manage their properties that works with nature rather than constantly fighting it. With the Master Gardener Pollination team, we reach out to the community and explain the importance of our pollinating insects for our gardens, for our landscapes, and for our food supply. So let me share my screen and let's get started. There we go. Without pollinating animals, most of our flowering plants would be in jeopardy, and this includes our most nutritious and tasty foods, such as our fruits, our nuts, our berries, and many of our vegetables. Our dinner plates would be so boring if it wasn't for our pollinators. It's really important that each one of us learns how to help support healthy pollinators so that they can keep doing that incredibly important job that they do, not just for us, but for our children, for our grandchildren, and hopefully for many generations yet to come. Master Gardeners is a University of Maryland extension program under the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources that takes that science-based knowledge about good, healthy, sustainable gardening and landscape management practices and makes it available to everyone in the community through various outreach programs such as these talks. If you're interested in learning more about us, or if you have questions about your gardens or your landscapes, maybe a project you're considering or a pest problem, then please visit the University of Maryland Extension website. Today, we're going to talk about the pollinators in our area. Who are they? Why are they important? What they need to survive? And we'll touch briefly on the threats to their survival. And finally, we'll discuss how each and every one of us can help promote healthy pollinators. Today, over 75% of the flowering plants require animals for transferring their pollen between their flowers, and that's almost exclusively insects. The insects visit the flowers for food. The nectar provides sugars for energy, and the sole purpose for this plant to produce nectar is to lure pollinating animals in to visit their blooms. It's kind of like the payment that the plant makes for having its pollen personally delivered. Pollen is also very nutritious. It's packed with it's packed with protein, it's got essential amino acids, it's got fats, and it's got carbs. In the case of our bees, turns out it's a perfect baby food. Pollination occurs when the grains of male pollen stick to the insect as it forages for food and is then transferred to the sticky female stigma on a flower in the same species. If it's the same flower or the same plant, it's called self-pollination, and many of our plants have devised strategies to avoid that from happening. The movement of plant pollen to another plant in the same species is called cross-pollination, and it's this mixing of genes through cross-pollinations that results in more vigorous plants that are able to adapt with changing conditions. And what do you think happens after an insect successfully pollinates flowers? Of course, the plant's going to produce fruits and seeds. The ovary swells to form a fruit or nut, and each fertilized ovule will become a hard seed from which a new plant has the potential to grow. Our pollinators are bees, flies, butterflies, moths, wasps, beetles, and hummingbirds are the new kids on the block. There are some very important bats that are pollinators, but they're mostly in the southwest of the country. We don't have any bats that pollinate here in Maryland. One of the most important things that all of our pollinating animals do have are wings, because wings allow the pollinator to spread the pollen in a much broader area, which helps to increase the genetic diversity of the plant species. All of our flowering plants compete to attract pollinating animals to visit their flowers. And the different traits that they use, such as their size, their shape, their color, their scent, and even their time of bloom, are referred to as pollinator syndromes. And ever since flowering plants first appeared, These flower traits have been evolving to attract a specific group of pollinators because that increases the likelihood of successful pollination. Some blossoms are more attractive to butterflies. Other blossoms might be more attractive to beetles or other pollinators. But most of our flowers have evolved to attract bees. And it's this coevolution between the insects and the plants that's resulted in this incredible diversity of species in both our plants and our insects. A good example of that selective adaptation would be the deep red tubular blooms that attract hummingbirds, but few insects can actually reach the nectar rewards deep inside. Let's meet our pollinators, and we're going to start with bees because they are the best pollinators by far, for several reasons. First off, the bees tend to be hairy, which aids in transferring the pollen between the flowers. And almost all female bees have a special area of branched hairs on their body called a scopa that is specifically for gathering pollen. Most of our female bees are going to have their scopa hairs on their legs, but there is a family of bees, these leafcutter bees, that have the scopa hairs on the underside of their abdomen. The main reason why bees are the best pollinators is because female bees collect pollen to take back to their nest to feed their young. All bee larvae eat pollen, and with few exceptions, our female bees are built to gather it. And it's this foraging for gathering pollen that makes them excel at pollination services. I'm sure everybody's familiar with how important the European honeybees are for pollination. They are amazing, hardworking creatures that are essential for our large-scale agriculture. Honeybees were introduced as domesticated bees in colonial times. They were brought for Europe for their wax to make candles, since there was no electricity, and of course for their honey as a food sweetener. It's this domestication that makes the honeybees so incredibly important for our large-scale agriculture, because you can take an entire honeybee colony that has 10 to 20,000 bees, you can put it in a box, you can put the box on a truck, and you can cart it clear across the country for a major crop at bloom time. For instance, there's about 3 weeks in February when over 1 million acres of almond trees all come into bloom at the same time in the California Central Valley, and they bring in over 2 million colonies of European honeybees in order to pollinate all those blossoms. That is well over 30 billion bees. It's also close to 80% of all the commercial honeybees in our country. Our large-scale agriculture would simply not be possible without the pollination services of our commercial beekeepers. Even though honeybees have been here for hundreds of years as an agricultural species, they did not co-evolve with our local ecosystems, and they are not native to North America. There are about 450 species of native bees in Maryland alone that have been essential for the reproduction of our flowering plants for over 100 million years. Now, most of our native bees are small, gentle, solitary ground nesting bees that are drastically different from everything you've heard about the European honeybees. There's no hive that has a single queen that can live for years. She has tens of thousands of daughters helping her tend her nest. There's no waggle dance giving directions to a good food source, perhaps miles away. There's no honey, and there's no barb stinger. Native bees are very unlikely to sting you. They are programmed more for flight before flight. In fact, no bees or wasps will sting you when they're visiting flowers because they don't defend the flowers. And of course, our males will never sting you because they just don't have the equipment. The vast majority of our native bee species in Maryland, that's over 90% of them, are solitary nesters, with each of the females constructing and provisioning her own nest without any help. We have examples here of the 5 families of bees that you'll find in Maryland. The eastern large carpenter bee, this is in the same family as the honeybees and the bumblebees, and it is our largest native bee. It's looks it looks similar to a bumblebee, but it has this, it's larger and has this black, shiny, almost hairless abdomen. These bees are very important for pollinating crops such as passion fruit, blackberries, and peppers. And of course, most of us are familiar with our carpenter bees because they tend to build their nest cavities in our unpainted and untreated timber. There are sweat bees, which are small to medium-sized ground nesting bees that carry their pollen on their legs. And many of the species are attracted to the salts in human sweat, which is where they got their common name, of course. Most of our sweat bees are dark and somewhat nondescript, but the most visible and frequent visitor in the sweat bee family are these beautiful green metallic sweat bees. There are mining bees. These are small to medium-sized dark bees that nest in the ground. You can usually tell them because they wear their scopa hairs high up on their abdomen, on their hind legs and up onto their thorax. And these will nest typically in meadows where there's areas of sparse or bare soil. But some of the species will nest in lawns. No worries, because their stinger is so weak it will not penetrate human skin. We have polyester bees, and these are also called plasterer bees or cellophane bees. They're named for a waterproof cellophane-like material that the female secretes in order to line her burrow and her brood cells. And these bees can even nest in riverbanks because they can tolerate some periodic flooding. And finally, we have this blue orchard bee, or bob for short, that's in the family of leafcutter bees. They're the ones that have the scopa hair on the underside of their abdomen. And the bees in this family nest above ground, usually in hollow tubes, such as hollow plant stems or maybe abandoned beetle holes in wood. These, the mason bees, got their common name because they use mud to divide their brood cells in their tunnel nests. Now, these bobs are in a class by themselves when it comes to pollinating any of the early blooming fruit trees or berry bushes in early spring. And what's really interesting is that their effectiveness at pollination is due to their lack of efficiency at actually getting that pollen home back to their nest. The mason bees are going to zigzag back and forth between the trees, and they belly flop all over the flowers, rubbing that dry pollen on the scopa hairs on the underside of her abdomen. And they leave substantially more pollen behind on flowers than other bees do. The blue orchard bees are raised commercially and shipped to orchards for their fruit tree pollination. Now, bees easily perceive colors in the blue and yellow end of the spectrum, so flowers that are bright white, yellow, blue, or purple are most attractive to them. Red colors will appear almost black to bees. However, they're still going to be very attracted to the yellow disc flowers in the zinnia here, or the stark white anthers that you'll find in the poppy. They might also be attracted to a strong floral or sweet scent. Nectar guides on the flowers can lead to the nectar source, and they can be a contrasting color, such as you see in this iris, or they can be ultraviolet, which is clearly visible to a bee's vision. This black-eyed Susan under a UV light reveals those dark ultraviolet nectar guides leading down to the nectaries. Some of our bee species have long tongues, and they like to forage on the flowers that have deep tubular shaped blooms, such as this monarda, or what's called bee balm. And other families of our bees have short tongues, and they can only access the resources that are in shallow flowers, such as this aster that you see here. The flower, once it's fertilized, stops producing nectar, and it may change its color in order to signal to the insect that there is no more food. This aster was in mid-November last year. As you can see, most of the actual flowers have lost their vibrant yellow color, but the ones that are still really vibrant, they have the polyester bees all over them. Flies will visit flowers and drink nectar, and some eat pollen, and while they're feeding, they act as pollinators. The flies are actually second only to bees in the importance for crop pollination, visiting up to 50% of our crops, agricultural crops. And since flies don't tend to nest, they're able to really roam where they're spreading that pollen much farther and helping to increase that genetic diversity, which helps our plants to survive changing conditions. There's over 1,100 species of flies here in Maryland. We have syrphid flies, which are the most prominent flies that we're going to find on flowers. They're also called hover flies or flower flies. The larvae of most of these hoverflies are predators of other insect pests. So they kind of do double duty, where as in larva, they're going to do pest control, and as an adult, they'll be a pollinator. Houseflies, tachinid flies, and blowflies are other very important fly group families that are important for pollination. The flies pollinate a few important food crops, such as our strawberries, our onions, and in particular our carrots, because most of our managed bees aren't attracted to that flower head that has so many teeny tiny flowers, but the flies really do enjoy, go after those particular flowers. Some of our fruit trees have evolved to especially attract flies, such as the mangoes and our native pawpaw. And if you like chocolate, thank the flies, because they're the ones that pollinate that cacao tree which produces our cocoa beans, which makes our chocolate. Flies are attracted to scents, and it's typically going to be a putrid scent like carrion. And they will be attracted to colored flowers that are dull, maybe brown or deep purple. Many of our flies have evolved a strategy to protect themselves from predators by mimicking bees and wasps. You can see that this syrphid fly looks a lot like a wasp, and this tachinid is looking an awful lot like a bumblebee. Butterflies are beautiful insects which evolved millions of years ago from moths. We have about 150 species of butterflies and skippers here in Maryland, and they measure anywhere from about 3/4 of an inch to over a 6-inch wingspan. The adults seek nectar, and they accidentally pollinate the plants when the pollen sticks to their bodies as they forage for the food. Butterflies have 2 pair of wings that are covered with these tiny colored scales. They also have a really long proboscis that they coil up. And when they uncoil that, they can get deep down in those tubular blooms to sip the nectar deep inside. Adult butterflies are going to favor red, yellow, orange, and pink blossoms. And they will follow nectar guides down to a nectar reward. Typically, the flowers that are going to attract butterflies are going to be large, showy flowers, but they will forage on clusters of flowers as long as there's a landing platform for them. Sweet scents draw butterflies in. You may have heard about the butterfly bush, the buddleia, which is not a good plant for butterflies. Well, how could that be? Butterfly plants are always covered with butterflies. It's because this plant is a fooler. It will lure the butterflies in with a scent they find absolutely irresistible, but there's only scant, poor quality nectar that is offered up as a reward for all their efforts. There are several families of butterflies here in Maryland, including our swallowtails. Now, these are the largest butterflies in the world, and they typically have tails on their hind wings. If you see a lot of butterflies gathered together in a mud puddle, it's typically the male swallowtails, and they're gathering nutrients that they'll pass to the females during mating. There are gossamer wing butterflies. These are our smallest butterflies, including coppers and the hair streak that you see here in the middle center upper picture. The larvae of some of these species are also carnivorous that eat aphids and ant larvae. So again, beneficial for pest control as well as a pollinator. There are brush-footed butterflies, and this is the largest family of butterflies, contains Many of our best known species, such as the monarchs, the painted ladies, the fritillaries, and the buckeyes, are all in this family. Now, the brush-footed butterflies got their common name because they have greatly reduced forelegs that they're covered with hair. So it appears that the butterflies in this family only have 4 legs instead of the 6 legs that every insect has. They do have 6 legs, it's just that they only appear to have 4. There are skippers, which are small moth-like butterflies, and they're named for their quick, erratic, darting flight habit. And you can usually tell the skippers because they hold their hind wings out straight from their body, and they hold their forewings up at a 45-degree angle. And finally, we have whites and sulfurs, which are unfortunately considered agricultural pests because their hosts are in the cabbage and the pea families. So what is a host plant exactly? Well, a host plant is any plant that an insect is able to eat. Most of our insect species are only adapted to eating specific plants. It may be all of the plants in a family of plants, such as in the pea family, you have clovers and soybeans and redbud trees, or it might be a specific species, genus of plants, such as all the plants in the Asclepias genus are going to be milkweeds, or it could even just be one specific species of plants. Apparently, that's hard for me to say. One single species of plant. And these are all called specialists. My favorite example of a species specific specialist would be this little mining bee. It's the Andrenia irrigenia, and she will only forage for pollen and nectar on spring beauty wildflowers. And these flowers are only out for 2 to 3 weeks. So she's got a lot of work to do in a short period of time to get her nest constructed and provisioned before her food sources disappeared. An insect that can eat from many plant families is called a generalist, and this is going to be our honeybees and our bumblebees and others, such as this Io moth, as a caterpillar, can eat from several different plant families. While our adult butterflies and moths can forage on nectar from any good nectar source plant, all of our butterflies and most of our moth species are specialists in their caterpillar stage, only able to feed on the leaves of their host plants. And one example of this relationship that I think that everybody's familiar with are the monarch butterflies and how they can only eat the leaves of the plants in the Asclepias genus, which are all milkweeds. There are almost 10 times as many moth species as there are butterflies, with over 2,000 species here in Maryland. But mostly they're out at night, so we really don't see how much diversity there is out there. The moths, because they feed at night, are going to be out searching for food by scent, usually a strong sweet scent, or they might be attracted to white or real pale flowers that reflect the moonshine. Here are several moth species that are out during the day, and my favorite is the hummingbird moth that you see foraging on that monarda or the bee balm. Most of our moths have a wing coupling device, which joins their forewings with their hind wings, so they appear to only have 2 wings, but they do have 4 wings, just like our butterflies. Wasps form one of the most diverse species-rich families of insects, with over 1,200 species here in Maryland. And the adult wasps eat nectar, but they spend most of their time hunting insects and spiders to capture and take back to their nest for their carnivorous young offspring. Wasps are attracted to flowers by scent, and it's usually going to be a nice sweet scent. They might also be attracted to a sweet-smelling beverage or perfume. There are only a very small number of wasp species that are social, and they are aggressive and territorial, such as our paper wasps, our hornets, and our yellow jackets. So you do want to avoid areas where they're building their nest. But most of our wasp species are solitary, spending all of their effort preparing a nest, and she only uses her stinger to paralyze her insect and spider prey to drag back to the nest as fresh food for her offspring. You can typically identify a wasp because they have an abdomen that is obviously constricted near their waist. And I usually tell by their long, spindly, hairless legs. Now, they may have barbs on them or spines for catching and holding onto their prey, but they won't be hairy and they will be very slender and long. And that brings us to our beetles, which were the first insects to visit flowers, and they're still essential for pollinating many of our ancient species, such as spicebush and magnolia. And the flowers that will attract a beetle are usually going to be large, solitary flowers that are either going to be white or dull white or even green, and they're going to be a bowl shape. The beetles are also attracted to scents that are spicy or fruity. Most of our beetles feed at flowers are eating pollen. They might also eat the flower petals and the leaf pieces and the other plant parts. But the flowers that depend on beetles for pollination tend to produce large quantities of pollen, and they don't waste much energy at all on producing nectar. The beetles are not especially efficient pollinators, but they are one of our top pollinators due to their sheer numbers, making up the largest set of pollinating insects with over 2,500 species here in Maryland. And you can tell a beetle because it's got this leathery forewings that covers its body like a shell, and it hides those membranous hind wings that it uses for flight when it's at rest. And the forewings usually form this straight line right down the middle of their back. Most of our pollinating insects go through 4 very unique stages in their life cycle. They start out as an egg, which shortly thereafter usually hatches into a larva. And the purpose of this larva stage is to eat. This is where all of the insect's growth is going to happen. And when it's finished with this stage, it's going to go into a pupa stage. And this is where that magical, mystical metamorphosis happens, where a totally, completely different looking animal comes out when it emerges as an adult. And of course, as an adult, all of our insect species are spending most of their efforts at reproduction. The only significant bird pollinator that we have in Maryland is the ruby-throated hummingbird. And they pollinate the blooms when they reach into the flowers and the grains of pollen stick to the feathers on their face. The hummingbirds prefer flowers that are bright red with deep tube-shaped blooms, but they're going to eat nectar from any good nectar source. And while nectar feeds their high energy requirements, their primary diet is made up of small insects. Now for the bad news. The pollinators, like most animals worldwide, are disappearing at an alarming rate, and there's several causes for their decline. The greatest risk of all is habitat loss and fragmentation. As humans continue to spread out further and further with their commercial properties, their suburban lawns, their agriculture, and other land developments, there's ever reduced natural resources for the pollinators to survive. And this is also where most people can help make a difference. Even in rural areas where you would think that the pollinators could thrive, the fields created by our large-scale agriculture are too large for many pollinators to cross to reach forage on the other side. Pesticides can kill the pollinators either from direct exposure, it can kill them over time from prolonged exposure, or it can affect their reproduction, or it can kill all the plants they need to survive. With bees, that toxin is frequently transferred to the developing bees in the nest on the pollen that's been collected. The mass rearing of bees and butterflies for commercial distribution has resulted in the introduction into the wild of numerous alien viruses and other diseases and parasites such as mites that our wild populations have no resistance to. And as if all that isn't enough, climate change can break that synchronous relationship between a specialist pollinator whose timing is based on warmth and their host plants, that are responding to timing based on sunlight. So it is truly a challenging life for pollinators in our world today. The good news is that it is really easy and fun to help protect our pollinating animals. And we do this by creating a safe habitat for them that has food, water, shelter, and space to reproduce. And you would avoid using pesticides as much as possible and have these undisturbed patches of habitat close together so that they can get from one to the other without risk to their life. And we're going to talk about each one of these ideas just a little bit more. The main characteristic to consider with habitat location and or a pollinator garden is that the site be in full sun at least part of the day and that it be mostly open. The ideal here is to have shelter and forage in the same area so that they're not at risk to get to forage from their nest and they don't waste all their energy getting back and forth between the two. For pollen and nectar food sources, you want to plant a variety of trees, shrubs, flowers, and herbs. For perennials and annuals, plant them in patches of like 3 to 7 plants, forming a really nice clump that insects can see as they're flying by. Choosing diverse plant groups with different sizes, shapes, heights, and colors. Plan to have your garden provide food throughout the entire growing season from early spring through late fall, and try to select plants that are known to be abundant with our nectar rewards. If those good forage plants just happen to be weeds, then consider leaving them to bloom as a resource for our pollinators. Native plants provide the best food source for our native pollinators due to coevolution, and most of our native bees have a strong preference for the pollen from our native plants. Those native plants have a number of advantages for us as well. They're less likely to require pesticides, they don't need fertilizers, they need less water, they're not going to become invasive. Okay, yes, we have some thugs out there that can be very aggressive, but technically they're not invasive. But what they are is so incredibly important because they promote the native biodiversity that's essential for a healthy, functioning ecosystem. And these ecosystems provide the sources, the services that we need as humans. They provide clean water, clean air, and food supply. You want to use straight species and avoid cultivars unless the cultivar has been developed for disease resistant. The plants that have been cultivated for pretty, such as colored leaves or longer lasting blooms or showier flowers, the plant spends all of its energy working on these pretty features, and it doesn't have the energy to put into the pollen and nectar resources that the pollinators need. There are countless good choices of native plants to support our pollinators, and there's several really good reliable sources of recommendations, such as the University of Maryland Extension, the Xerces Society, the Pollinator Partnership, and the Maryland DNR, just to name a few. My personal favorite is this National Wildlife Federation Plant Finder, which makes really good native recommendations based on your zip code. Remember, right plant, right place. If the growing conditions are right for a plant species, it will perform well without help. And again, avoid those fancy cultivars, especially the ones with double blooms, because that is always at the sacrifice of the plant reproductive parts. And be sure, please, that the plants and seeds that you purchase have not been treated with systemic pesticides. The big box stores frequently still carry stock that's been treated. So try to shop at trusted nurseries where you can be assured that the plants that you're purchasing have not been treated with insecticides. Some of the most successful plants that we have found for attracting and sheltering pollinators in the Baltimore County Master Gardener Demonstration Garden are shown here. And you might be surprised that there's grasses there since grasses are wind pollinated, but they have exceptional shelter value for our pollinators. And we would absolutely love for you to come visit the demo garden out at the Agricultural Center on Chuan Road and enjoy seeing our pollinators in action. Flowers that bloom in very early spring are a critical resource for the early emerging bees, such as our new bumblebee queens, our mining bees, and our mason bees, and for our butterflies that overwinter as adults, such as the mourning cloak, the question mark, and the camas. These spring ephemeral wildflowers are an especially good source of food for those early emerging pollinators. The bulbs, the flowering bulbs that we put in, our daffodils, our tulips, they are really highly derived and they are not especially good resources of pollen and nectar for our pollinators. If there's nothing else out there, they'll forage on them, but they're not especially good source. The exception to this would be those grape hyacinths, because they actually are a good resource for our early pollinators. Native trees, the early flowering trees, are an excellent source of resources for our early emerging pollinators, such as our native red maple, the willows, the eastern redbud, the black cherry, and the wild crabapple are all really good choices. Now, there is simply an abundance of wonderful native summer blooming plants that provide quality pollen and nectar sources. So a few of the examples of our super pollinator plants that we found are the Monarda, which is called bee balm. We've got the Liatris, which is called blazing star. We've got the milkweeds. They're the Asclepias genus. This one here is butterfly weed. We've got Atreuchium, which is called Joe Pye weed. I hate that it's called weed. It's not a weed. It's a beautiful plant that the bees and the butterflies absolutely love. So Joe Pye. We've got this Gaillardia, which is called blanket flower. And in my gardens, this blooms for 2 to 3 months and is always covered with a real diverse group of bees. And for attracting the most diversity of all pollinators, we found that the mountain mint, the Pycnanthemum, is the best source for bringing those diversity in to visit our gardens. Some sources are going to tell you that Echinacea is native to the mid-Atlantic. Most of them will tell you it's not. But what it is an easy to grow composite that the bees and the butterflies love. So we say yes to coneflowers. Fall blooming plants are an especially important energy source for our late season pollinators. Our bumblebee queens, next year's queens, are going to have to bulk up so that they can survive through the winter. And of course, we have to help refuel those monarch butterflies that are passing by in that epic journey of theirs down to the Oyamel fir forests in Mexico. So plant asters, goldenrod, the ironweed. One of my favorites is this horse mint, which is actually Monarda punctata. And the native perennial sunflowers are an excellent source of late season pollen and nectar food sources, such as this thin leaf sunflower and the oxeye are all really good choices for autumn resources. Annuals can provide a wonderful source of pollen and nectar all season long, including well into late fall sometimes. And our favorites have been the zinnias, the cosmos, the salvias, and the sunflowers. Herbs and mints are also excellent sources out there, but you have to let them bloom in order for them to be good for the pollinators. And some of those mints can be real spreaders, so you might want to grow them in containers. The highly derived plants from the big box stores, such as the begonias and the geraniums and the tea roses, they're beautiful because they've been cultivated for human aesthetics. And there really isn't any pollen and nectar sources for the pollinators in these plants. So don't plan on putting them in your pollinator garden. There are flower varieties that have been cultivated as cut flowers, and like these sunflowers that you see here, have been cultivated to have no pollen so that it won't mess up your dining room table. So as far as your pollinator garden, avoid the cut flower varieties as well. Be sure to plant plenty of host plants for your butterfly caterpillars. And this is just a short list of some of the more popular host plants for our butterflies. In addition to food sources, you may want to provide water sources in shallow dishes with sloping sides and plenty of perches with small rocks or pebbles. A muddy site in early spring would help provide the building materials for our mason bees to build their tunnel nests. And it would also provide a nice spot for those the male swallowtails to puddle together to gather their nutrients. If you do a water source, then change the water at least 2 to 3 times a week during the warm mosquito breeding season. It is so much better to stop the mosquitoes in their larval stage than once they've matured and flown. Provide a safe place for your pollinators by keeping some undisturbed, untidy corners and maybe piles of woody debris and pruned stems. Logs on the ground are perfect nesting and shelter areas. Excuse me. Sorry about that. If you can, leave snags standing if they're not a risk to person or property. And please, please, please leave your leaves in your gardens. Leaf cover is an excellent area for shelter and nesting sites. In fact, you want to gently rake the leaves into your gardens, and they're going to help insulate your perennials through the winter. They're going to help prevent the weed colonization. They'll keep the weeds from touching the ground and germinating. And they're going to put the nutrients back into the soil to feed your plants in your gardens. So please rake the leaves back in your garden and leave them there. The perennials are going to come right up through those leaves in spring. Shelter is especially important during the times that the pollinating insects are inactive. So protect all of your overwintering sites by putting off any fall cleanup until spring. Some people will tell you to wait till it's in the 50s for 5 consecutive days before a spring cleanup. But our pollinating insects come out at various different times throughout the spring, summer, and fall. So it's best not to do any more than a little gentle tidying up in spring. You do want to leave some bare areas of soil, maybe covered lightly with these mulch leaves or a light leaf cover for our ground nesters. In the fall, you can cut your perennial stems back to 12 to 18 inches, and those stalks will be used for the next year's bees when they're finding their nesting areas. And that new growth in spring is quickly going to hide that stalk stubble and the leaf cover from people, but it doesn't hide it from the bees. And finally, consider replacing areas of turf grass with beneficial habitat. Turf grass provides no food value and it reduces the nesting opportunities for our pollinators. The only thing you're feeding here are Japanese beetle grubs. But if having a lawn is important to you, then consider setting your mower blade higher at 4 inches and letting the clover and violets and the dandelions bloom before cutting. Better yet, replace areas of turf grass with a native tree and then surround it with a low growing, native, shade tolerant ground cover, such as the Tiarilla cordifolia you see here. These are foam flowers. And you plant that out to the drip line. And this is a perfect way to improve your yard with a healthy space for nesting and overwintering shelter for our pollinators. Even if you don't have space for a pollinator garden, you can put out pots with beneficial food sources. And another good way to help pollinators is to simply talk about them with family, friends, and neighbors. Unfortunately, way too many people only think of insects as pests, when in reality, only a very small percentage of insects are ever pests to people. People don't notice the insects living all around us in our world because they simply don't bother us. So help spread the word about the importance of pollinators and managing our properties in a way that helps support them. Other ways that you might help would be to work with a group at installing and maintaining a pollinator garden in a public space, such as a school, a church, or a library. Or you could coordinate with your neighbors to do a pollinator habitat that's tied together with your neighbors. Or if you're a gardener, what's very important is to learn the integrated pest management technique for controlling pests with the least toxic ways possible. And you can learn more about the IPM from the University of Maryland Extension Home and Garden Information Center website. And that wraps up the talk for pollinators today. I hope you found the information interesting and enjoyable, and that you see just how easy it is to help our pollinators. And I hope to see you soon out at the Master Gardener Demonstration Garden at the Agricultural Center on Schwann Road. So thank you for your time, and I'd be glad to see you in our gardens. Thank you.